Okay, so I'm pleased to introduce our next moderator for our first session after lunch. Larry Weber is a professor of civil and environmental engineering and the director of IIHR-Hydroscience and Engineering at the University of Iowa. Lately, he's been a man about Iowa, working on the new HUD project on flood resiliency in Iowa. So I'll have him up to introduce the speakers that will be talking on the influence of agriculture on water quality.
All right, thank you, David. It's a great opportunity for me to be here on this Friday, and I was very inspired this morning in the keynote talk to hear about what a vision might look like for 2116, and it was really inspirational as we're starting this HUD project and we're working in 8 watersheds in Iowa, really trying to build a watershed community that will address both flood mitigation as well as water quality improvement. The session that we're about to hear from brings 3 speakers to the stage. Each has their own expertise, and we're very delighted about the list of folks that we have coming. We have Brett Lorenzen, who will kick us off from the Environmental Working Group. He'll be followed by Roger Wolf from the Iowa Soybean Association, and then Neil Hamilton from Drake University Law School will kind of wrap the session up. They'll each get about 15 minutes to share some of their thoughts about watershed improvement and the influence of agriculture on Iowa's drinking water. And then we'll open it up for a moderated discussion, which we should have a good solid 30-40 minutes for that portion of the program. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Brett Lorenzen from the Environmental Working Group. He is the Director of Midwest Outreach for that group. He's been gracious enough to join us today on a bit of a short notice. Craig Cox was originally on the program, as you see from your conference materials, but had to step away due to a family emergency, and Brett has offered to come and join us today. So, Brett?
You have to bear with me here. I'm kind of delivering the boss's comments or the boss's slides with my comments, and sometimes that can be a careful dance you have to walk. So as we enter this discussion in the afternoon, we've been asked to comment on the footprint of agriculture and some of our thoughts on how agriculture impacts the situation in Iowa. And if we look at a map of the state of Iowa and map row crops, if you look at this map, everything in yellow is tilled land that is in row crops. Our landscape in Iowa did not get this way naturally. It did not get this way because of economic forces. It got this way because we made conscious decisions to subsidize, fund, and ensure that this happened at the policy level. Policymakers decided Iowa was going to look this way. Now, in comparison to Flint at that level, the problem we had in Flint was a whole bunch of people making science decisions that had no science in their folders, no science in their background, and no realization that science was a problem. In Iowa, we have made every one of the decisions we have made about row crop agriculture and the side effects of it with binders full of material that told us what the environmental problems were likely to be if we did it, and then we did it anyway. So it's a little bit different on that front. And a good way to illustrate that is we got our first warning of the Gulf hypoxia problem in the early 1990s. And we knew in Iowa we were going to have to do something to limit or potentially even take land out of production. Since that time, we have added 2 million acres of fence rows, pastures, and buffers that used to be in grass to the row crop total. So even after we knew we had to stop doing it, we did 10% more of it since then. The real problem we have with this is that Iowa's soil is very productive, and it leads a lot of people to want to think of Iowa as the picture on the left. When we think of our nitrogen problems, that's what we think of Iowa. But the reality is that the pictures on the right are what Iowa looks like 8 months a year. And that is where our problem comes from. It comes from the uncovered soil and the things that are left over after the 4 months of corn growing. The bulk of our leaching and the bulk of our other things come from our failure to deal with the exposed land for 8 months a year. That is being exacerbated by the fact that we have drastically increased the drainage under that land. When we first passed the Clean Water Act, the total amount of drainage in Iowa's farm fields would have stretched from Des Moines to the moon if you put it end to end. If you do that tally today, it will go from Des Moines to the moon and back 3 times. So we have vastly expanded how much drainage we put, and that drainage is multiples more efficient than the old clay tile we put in there. We have created a very leaky environment. On top of that, we've created a climate where more rain and more water is falling onto the environment and making things even worse. Again, every one of those decisions was made consciously with data in hand, and we decided this was the way we wanted to go. One of the things that was mentioned earlier, and one of the things EWG has been concerned about on the agricultural side, are the things we don't hear about. We hear a lot about nitrates and the need to remove nitrates from drinking water. First time this morning I had heard in the discussion disinfection byproducts mentioned. We looked at these about a decade ago very carefully. Disinfection byproducts happen when the chemicals you use to remove the nitrates have chemical reactions and cause new chemicals or create new chemicals which happen to be carcinogenic. When we report these at the level of our drinking water systems, we let people average them. And over the average of a year, no water system has ever violated the standard for these. But when we went back and FOIA'd the data from individual water plants and got their daily spikes, this map shows that in yellow are all of the times that a water system hit 75% or higher of the limit of the carcinogenic byproducts of the disinfection process in drinking water. And the red ones are times that it exceeded the safe health limit during the 4-year period that we looked at it. That's about 50 times that we had carcinogenic levels of byproducts in drinking water in just the Corn Belt of the Midwest. Similarly, we hear a lot about the N side of the equation, but we forget about the P side of the equation. And cyanotoxins, we hear about in our lakes. We hear about when our beaches close. We hear about when a dog dies on a hunting expedition. What we don't think about is those same cyanotoxins come into the drinking water, and they also have to be removed by the drinking water utilities when they get there. When we looked at the data over a 3-year sample period to see which water utilities in Iowa that actually bother to measure for cyanotoxins and that use surface supplies for drinking water, which is a rather limited number, you'll see that all of the red are years in which that city's drinking water system had at least one major cyanotoxin-related problem with drinking water in that year. And you'll see that there are multiple systems that had it every single year we looked at it. Cyanotoxins and the byproduct problem I mentioned earlier are symptoms of the phosphorus problem in the nitrate equation. We spend all of our time talking about N and nitrogen on corn and everything, forgetting that there's this second component that we really aren't doing a lot about yet that is causing a whole nother series of problems. We see the potential flints in Iowa being these things over here on the side that we're not paying attention to. We're paying attention to the big problem. We aren't looking at the problems we're creating, trying to solve that problem. We feel that this is not all bad news. We know today exactly what we need to do to stop these problems. We have every practice we need to make them go away in our arsenal today. We wouldn't have to go do any more research. We could take things we know and put them on the ground. We know that reducing tillage has a drastic effect on the runoff from the field. We know even better that putting grass back on the ground has a very drastic impact. Grassed waterways, reducing stream bank erosion, keeping manure out of streams. The biggest parts of our problem are a very small subset of what's going on. And we have spent billions of dollars trying to do this. In just the USDA programs, we've spent over $3 billion in the last decade trying to get these practices that we know will solve the problem on the ground. The question then becomes, why aren't we making any progress on this? And the answers to that are also somewhat straightforward. The number one problem is poor targeting. The practices farmers most want to do, like managing nitrogen, are production related and not environmental related. So they keep choosing ones that increase profits. Nobody tells them you have to choose a buffer, you have to get a grass waterway. As long as you can choose only the ones you want, the ones that are most effective rarely get chosen. The second problem we have, especially in the Farm Bill, is that we have this mentality that if we put $1 billion into the Farm Bill, 1/50th of it has to go to every state, and then that has to be split equally among every politician's district and every county. Well, agricultural pollution problems don't happen by district maps for politicians. They happen where farming happens. There's no reason most of the money to address these problems shouldn't be flowing to the Corn Belt. There's very little reason Arizona should be getting a whole lot of money to address nutrient problems when they really don't have that many nutrient problems. But our system allows that to happen. We also have a problem with voluntary. The landowners that volunteer are rarely the landowners that are the biggest problem. We know from studying a wide variety of problems that 70 to 80% of every agriculture-related environmental problem we look at is caused by 20 to 30% of landowners. Now, it's not the same people causing all the problems. Everybody has their problems with their unique land. But if we don't tell the people who are causing the problems that they have to change, the other 80% can volunteer and put everything in place, and 70 to 80% of that problem is still occurring. You have to go after the people that are causing the problem and require them to change if you want to see progress. And that leads to no accountability. We don't have anywhere in this system anything that kicks in and takes anything away from anybody outside of a limited application of conservation compliance and crop insurance in a handful of states on certain kinds of lands in certain kinds of situations. Everybody else has no implication or no consequences for doing or not doing anything. And the fatal flaw of the system is none of this is permanent. And this is what we feel is the current biggest discussion point that we need to get to. If we looked at our landscape, we did 5 counties in Iowa, and we had interns sit down and we looked at every inch of every field in 2 time frames to see what happened over the course of time with these conservation practices. In this particular case is a great example of a field that was drastically in need of grass protection and buffers. There's a creek or a drainage ditch running down the middle. 5 years later, somebody has put in the buffer and the grass waterways to protect that, done exactly what we advocate for them to do. At the same time, we've got a field here with fantastic buffers all the way around a prairie pothole, and 5 years later, all of that has been plowed under. And that has been since the nutrient reduction strategy has been in place, and we have been working diligently to educate people not to do this. Similarly, with grass waterways, this is a field where I'm not sure how close you have to be, but you can see there are very, very visible gullies running through that field. 5 years later, that farmer's got grass waterways on every one of those gullies and is stopping the erosion. But again, here's a set of gullies that had been very well treated, and when we go back 5 years later, you end up with grass waterways that have just completely gone. When you look at the numbers and we crunch the numbers on these counties to see what was happening, if we looked at the buffers within 75 feet of water, we lost 119 acres and gained 45 through these programs. We did make some gains in some areas of grass waterways, but while we gained 26 miles of waterways, we lost 21 on the way there, so we really only gained 5. When we report from the state and federal level about what we have done for conservation, you see 26 miles of new waterways. You don't see one mention of the 21 miles that were ripped out in the course of getting there. And if we don't start counting that, we aren't even doing science at that point. If you aren't counting all the data, you're only counting half the story, it's always going to look good. To solve this problem, EWG advocates that we start talking about a basic standard of care for all landowners. If you own any land in Iowa that is not farmland and you rip the grass off it, regulations kick in to control your soil loss and to control what happens. You have to put buffers at the edge. You see the hay on all the highway areas where it's dug up. Nothing like that applies to farmland. We don't think a solution that requires farmers to run around and get permits for everything is going to work any more than farmers do. We don't think we should be telling individual farmers at a highly restrictive level what they shouldn't do, how much nitrogen they should put on their field or not. That's an agronomist decision. They need to get that into their system and do it right. We need to look at the practices as well that are giving agriculture a bad name. That is really the biggest problem we have for agriculture right now, is a lot of people are just looking down on it because we're not seeing any progress, no data is being shared, nobody believes any stories of progress because we don't have that accountability in the system. We need solutions that the average person can look at and say, that farmer's doing a good job. We've got to be able to give people the ability to do these things without intrusive testing, without demanding to go on a farm and see what you're doing. And you can do that. And we think that these kinds of programs or these kinds of approaches should be the foundation that we build on. We should not pay for what I'm about to propose. These should be done by every landowner, whether a farmer or not, before you qualify for any subsidies for anything else. We think the starting point for this discussion is 4 practices. Grass waterways on every flow line in the state of Iowa. Those are on the maps. We know where they are. Water flows in the exact same place in the field every single year. Get grass on that spot. Stop the erosion and stop the runoff. Grass on that land will reduce by 95% the amount of surface nitrogen moving across those gullies. It will strip it out of there. Cattle out of the streams. E. coli is also a problem that we forget we still have on numerous waterways in Iowa. We don't have to fence them to get them out. Numerous conservation organizations have come up with rock approaches and bush approaches to keep cattle out of streams that don't require expensive fencing. No more manure on frozen ground, period. That manure does not make it to the soil, and no one can tell you with a straight face that's a good idea. There's no reason we should be doing that, and it has to stop. And the last one is a 50-foot buffer on every open waterway. The picture on the far right is a cornfield in Iowa falling into the river. You should not be allowed to plant in a way that leads to this problem. Those are not magic bullet solutions. But if we put those 4 practices on the ground in every field in Iowa next year, in 10 years, most of our N&P problems are going to be drastically under control. And then we can start using some of the new things we're finding and swapping them in. As we prove they work and as we know they work, if a farmer can show they can do it better, we're all in favor of that. But until we get to the point where we're doing something on every piece of land, the only logical starting point from our perspective and the only way to avoid the flints down the line is you've got to start with everybody doing the same thing in the same way fairly to get results. Once you have results, then we can debate more about what we could do in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Brett. Our next speaker is Roger Wolf, and I really do appreciate Brett getting this session started off very dynamically. I anticipate that Roger's going to carry that forward, and Neil's going to run sweep, and then we'll have a great conversation. But Roger Wolf, a longtime conservationist in the state of Iowa, is the Director of Environmental Programs and Services for the Iowa Soybean Association, recognized not only across this state but around the country for the excellent work the Soybean Association has done working with farmers to implement conservation on their land. So, Roger.
Thanks, Larry. Well, I'm going to give you a little different perspective. I'm here today. I'm going to share a little bit of my vision for the path forward for protecting water. We're an agricultural dominated state. That's no secret. We're proud of that fact. And my presentation will get in and talk a little bit about the challenges, and probably the big message that I hope to convey is to give you some perspective of the scope and scale of the challenges that we're owning. I also want to speak a little bit about the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. It wasn't part of my presentation, but I think it's important to mention that in 2016 we kicked off the Iowa Ag Source Water Collaborative, and this is in cooperation with the Iowa Corn Growers, Iowa Soybean, Agribusiness Association, working in concert with our agencies and working closely with our utilities and American Water Works. So we're real proud of that fact. And I heard mentioned earlier that water is a real local issue, right? Everything happens locally. So we have to have action oriented locally. There's many things I'm thinking about, Brett, that I wanted to challenge, but I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna go through my presentation here and and talk a little bit from my perspective. You'll note that One Water Iowa, that's what I want to talk about. This isn't a rural versus urban issue. Water's a need, not a want. And our cities need to have water that has to be affordable. We have to have effective treatment plants. We heard that about the morning's discussion. I was real impressed with the 2116 vision. I think a one water approach will help us realize that vision 100 years from now. So, yeah, we understand the challenges, and here they are, right? We all know this. We have erosion in our stream banks. We have erosion in our fields. We have flooding issues, flooding concerns. We have nutrient loss. And we have to work to address those issues. And in fact, we have been working, and that, what was it, $3 billion we've invested federally in farm programs. We've made big progress in soil conservation. Is it enough? No, absolutely not. It's not enough. Resource management is continuous. It never stops. It's something we have to be diligent and do all the time. We also understand the challenges downstream, and I was pleased that Larry's here and talking about the HUD grant, and here's a picture of Cedar Rapids in 2008. These are community challenges, right? When an entire community is impacted. The Cedar River starts up in Minnesota, and so when that water comes downstream and we have these flooding impacts, it impacts all our, and I have family that lives in Cedar Rapids that are impacted by this, and Cedar Rapids has had to make some significant adjustments in how they're going to deal with this. We all have heard about and the nitrate removal plant with the city of Des Moines. It's nothing new. It's been a chronic problem on the Raccoon River. Des Moines uses the Raccoon and sometimes the Des Moines as their source water. We also know there are regional challenges, Gulf of Mexico, Mississippi River. So if you want to work on nutrient issues in this country, you're going to come to Iowa and Illinois, right? You're going to work with agriculture, and that's what we're doing. You need to recognize that this started a long time ago. You know, we aren't just draining the landscape now. It started 100 years ago. Here's an article from the 2010 New York Times. Iowa farmers invested the equivalent of what it took to build the Panama Canal to drain the Iowa landscape. That map that Brent showed, about 70% of that landscape is drained. We could not grow crops in this state without that drainage infrastructure. These folks did this with shovels and picks and steam engines. And these are our grandfathers and our aunts and uncles that made this state into this, the most hydrologically modified landscape on the planet. And that's reality. It's also created an asset that's worth $200 billion. $200 billion for the state of Iowa. Think about that. You know, when the Louisiana Purchase, I can't remember what the Louisiana Purchase, what the government paid, I think it was 50 cents an acre. So think about the value of the Iowa landscape. We also know that there's variable rainfall events, and we're getting more frequent high-intensity storms, and this causes flooding. This is on the Raccoon River in the summer of 2015. So farmers have no choice but to farm in the face of one year it's drought, the next year it's extreme rain. That has impacts on the loss of soil and the loss of nutrients from our landscape. Trying to get at some of the scope and scale, when we think of the Raccoon River, here's a map of the Raccoon River watershed. It's two HUC 8 scale watersheds. HUC is Hydrologic Unit Code. That's the USGS address naming convention. Within that watershed, there's smaller scale watersheds. These are HUC 12 watersheds. There's 108 HUC 12 watersheds, 108, 2.3 million acres. 1.7 million is row crop agriculture. Okay? So at Sac City, and I put Sac City on the map there, there's 22 Huck 12 watersheds above Sac City. Assuming it rains above Sac City, it takes a day for the water to get down to Des Moines. So I just wanted to give you a perspective of the landscape, okay? Now I want to give you a perspective of the water. We heard about acre feet of water earlier today, so you can think of an acre of about, it's nearly a football field. So this is just a visualization to picture. 1 acre foot of water would be a foot of water on a football field, okay? So this next map or illustration is just a visualization of all the football fields with 1 acre foot of water that would be draining through Des Moines per hour, okay? The green is the Raccoon River and the blue is the Des Moines River. Now, Des Moines Waterworks can take water from either source, but for the sake of illustration, I wanted to show that there's 13 acre feet per hour that they use. Des Moines Waterworks is a 100 million gallon water utility. They have that capacity to deliver 100 million gallons. So they're basically removing about 6.5% of the flow, okay? Now, think about what we're owning upstream, okay? This is really important. To treat the water upstream, we have to treat the 196 football fields. Des Moines Waterworks is dealing with the 13 football fields. They're just taking a slice out of that water. They're not taking the whole river. The nitrate removal plant is a 10 million gallon a day capacity treatment system. So what they're doing is they're treating a portion of those 13 football fields, okay? Now you think about the scope and scale of that. The One Water Iowa vision, you know, we have one state. We have 99 counties. We have 70,000 miles of stream. We have 56 of those Huck 8 watersheds that cover, that's the delineation USGS has. There's 1,600 Huck 12 watersheds. A Huck 12, the reason I mention that is because at that scale, we can get our arms around these issues and we can work with a group of farmers. There might be 50, 60 farmers. It's a neighborhood, right? Think of a neighborhood where we can work with those group of farmers to come up with strategies to impact the downstream water. So 1,600 Huck 12 watersheds. You can't really see what's behind that, but you might have noticed the color change. There's 88,000 farms. And of those 88,000 farms, there's roughly 300,000 landlords. Okay? Scope and scale. There's 947 cities within that, okay? 500 of those cities are under a population of 500. I saw some slide earlier, it was 11 communities above 50,000, isn't that right? So think about, you know, all those communities have to have water. They need it. They have no choice, right? They need their water. We also have wastewater treatment plants in those cities. The nutrient reduction strategy, which was launched just a couple of years ago, is currently in a demonstration phase. And here's the map. I think there's 16 since this map was built. I think we have 40 water quality initiative projects. Some of those are in cities. And we're demonstrating technologies for these communities. The next phase of the nutrient strategy is how do we spread it? How do we scale it up? Are we owning this issue? Are we serious about this issue? This is what it's going to take. If we're going to be successful in achieving 45% reduction of nutrients leaving the state, we're going to have to scale it up. We're going to have to scale it up urban and rural together. At Iowa Soybean Association, we're in the business of this. We've been in it for some time. I've been there 16 years. I find myself under the umbrella of the research program, And I'm objective 2, and I deal with natural resources and environmental quality. But we have 25 staff that work in this space, and we work directly to improve the competitiveness of the Iowa soybean farmer. And we do that by improving productivity, by helping them capture efficiency gains in their management to help them be productive and profitable. But we have to take care of natural resources and environmental quality, because that's a key part of the productivity. This is a map that illustrates the scope and scale of our program. We're working in these targeted watersheds. And one of the key features of the work that we do directly with farmers is we embrace monitoring. And it was interesting to hear Barb talk about the importance of monitoring to the operation of a water utility. You can't manage things that you don't measure. So we're in the business, and I'll trademark this at this meeting, the 4 M's. We've been hearing about the 4 R's, so this is the 4 M's. Measuring, monitoring, and mapping, all to enable better decision-making for management, right? And so these are some of the tools we use. We have an accredited water quality testing lab within our headquarters in Ankeny. And I am certain that we do more monitoring than the entire state right now. And we're very proud of that fact. And in fact, I should mention, I see LD back here, Des Moines Waterworks was a strong collaborator with our program over many years and helped us get into the monitoring business, helped us understand the importance of monitoring. And that's really enabled us to take action. It helps guide where we do our work. It helps give us, as Barb said, it gives us a baseline of where we're starting, right? And it helps give us credibility so we can measure progress over time. I'm going to switch watersheds a little bit. This is an example. We do a lot of watershed planning. We're proponents of watershed approach. This is part of the One Water approach. This is a map of the Rock Creek watershed, which is in the upper Cedar River Basin. This is right out of the watershed plan. This group of farmers, and it's not our plan, it's their plan, this group of farmers have embraced the goals for the non-point source nutrient strategy goals, 41% nitrogen loads and 29% phosphorus. They also want to increase organic matter by 1%. You note there they want to increase productivity and profit. That's important to them, to their families. They also want to increase upland wildlife habitat. We heard earlier there's opportunities that synergy can be made by supporting wildlife habitat. We can improve the water at the same time dealing with aquatic life as well. But more importantly, when you think at deploying these strategies, and we go through a planning process where we assess, we take the science from the strategy, we assess the current conditions, and then we think about where can that strategy be deployed. So I would agree with Brett that we need to do targeting. Not every practice is going to work in every location. We need to optimize the placement of practices, and that just makes effective and efficient use of limited resources. We can spend that $3 billion better. We agree with that. And the way to do that is through doing watershed plans and working with the local farmers to do that. But look at $5.5 million, and this is an infrastructure investment. This is a rural infrastructure investment, just like we have for our drinking water and our wastewater. I'm suggesting that we have to make these investments in our rural watersheds. So the key to the Cedar River and Rock Creek, public-private partnerships. When the water in Rock Creek, when that water falls in Rock Creek, 5 days later it's in Cedar Rapids. Okay, that's just, Rock Creek happens to be 2 Huck 12s. Okay, remember I said 1,600 Huck 12s statewide? Somebody's probably running the math right now. So I'm going to flip through the last several slides here. Here are some of the projects that are being deployed in the Rock Creek watershed. This, by the way, this watershed is going to have the highest concentration of edge of field practices like tile line bioreactors, which is basically a treatment system at the end of the tile line using wood chips in a trench, saturated buffers where we're coming back from the tile outlet and we're forcing that water to go through a stream buffer system, constructed wetlands located lower in the landscape so that we're capturing that water and treating the water using a natural process, and wetlands can do that. No-till, and here's one thing I will challenge Brett, not all that cropland is tilled. So no-till has been a practice which we really, in the 90s, really expanded significant use of it. Could we do more no-till? Absolutely. And more farmers are experimenting with no-till and strip-till, and here's just a picture of strip-till. And there's farmers in the Rock Creek watershed that have bought strip-till rigs, and they're helping their neighbors. These are investments. You have to have investments in infrastructure to use these kinds of practices. Cover crops, absolutely, can be a game changer. And Iowa is on an upswing in the use of cover crops. Is it adequate? No. Do we need more? Yes. So my vision for the future is a one water vision, a one water Iowa vision that brings our cities and our rural communities together. It's integrated, multi-objective water management for creating a sustainable water future. You know, I heard that at the beginning, that this is about a sustainable water future for all. Agriculture wants that. We need that. Our cities need that. When you look at the point source side of the nutrient reduction strategy, these cities are going to have to crank down their permits on their point source side. We need to be working in these watersheds because it makes more sense probably to do some of that work upstream. You know, a lot of these cities aren't contributing that much to the nutrient flow. This is an agriculture state. There's 30 million acres draining into our rivers. We need to make this investment. Are the investments we're making adequate? We don't think so. There's going to need to be more investment if we're serious, if we're owning this issue. Keep in mind the scope and scale. So with that, I look forward to the questions, and I'll stop.
Well, now the big question is, Neil, can you follow those two? So we'll see how well Neil does. Neil Hamilton, we're delighted to have him here today. He's the Dwight Opperman Chair of Law and Director of the Agricultural Law Center at Drake University in Des Moines. He's directed the center since 1983. Can that be possible? I mean, I'm really amazed by that. So
3 years.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. So Neil, thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. Thank you all. I appreciate the applause. I want to thank Larry and David for the invitation, the opportunity to be with you, and I'm pleased to certainly be on a panel with friends, good friends, Roger and Brett. And just so you know, both of their organizations, EWG and Iowa Soybean Association, are committed to Iowa's future and our water quality future, and they're both progressive leaders in their own way in this work. And my job today, and Larry asked me really to provide you with an update on the Des Moines Waterworks litigation, and perhaps to talk a little bit about a couple other water quality related developments. And so I'm assuming I go this way. A disclaimer, I don't have a dog in the fight. I don't work for the Waterworks, but as a lawyer, I've been following it. And, so I think that it's fair to say that in Iowa's water quality discussion, the Waterworks litigation has probably been the most significant development of the last several years. It is, as I think you realize, somewhat controversial, but polls show it continues to garner a majority support from Iowans. And regardless of your perspective, I think it's important to recognize that the litigation has played an important and invaluable role for the state, because it's changed the trajectory of our discussion about water quality issues. And as from a lawyer's standpoint, as I'll talk a little bit about, it's a very complex piece of litigation with some very nuanced legal questions, but it has done, I think, a service for the state of Iowa. How many of you like a little bit of an update or a review as to exactly what's involved in the lawsuit? Oh, look at that show of hands. Okay. Well, so some of you may have heard me give a talk at the water conference back in March a year ago, in which I gave a talk about 16 things to know about the waterworks litigation. And I'll just run through a couple of those real quickly. You know, this is a citizen suit that was filed under the Clean Water Act, and it essentially claims that the drainage districts are point sources that need NPDES permits from the EPA. The key legal issue, one of them, is that the drainage ditches, the systems that are managed by the drainage districts are artificial conveyances of polluted groundwater, and that's what, in their argument, triggers both the application of the Clean Water Act and the non-point or the point source requirement. It is also an issue to recognize is that the claim is that the nitrates entering the drainage ditches are groundwater as they have come out of the tile outlets that are flowing either through the tile systems maintained by the districts or into the ditches, and that they're not part of the agricultural stormwater runoff exemption, the non-point source exemption that you have in the Clean Water Act. It's important to recognize the lawsuit is against the drainage districts, not against individual farmers, though it certainly has some indirect effect. And it's also important to recognize that it's not against the counties. It's against the County Board of Supervisors in their capacity as the trustees of these drainage districts, and I'll come back to that in a moment. It's a perhaps more significant issue than people may think. Another key legal point, nothing will happen very quickly, and I'll clarify that in a few moments as well. The choice of the drainage districts, I think, was very strategic in terms of the testing that the waterworks had done, being able to show the timing of the spikes and the nitrogen, and also in terms of the location. It was in part designed to get around the golf courses and goose poop events that people use in terms of what the source of the pollution is. I think a couple other things just to recognize. Certainly the possible implications or effects of the lawsuit are really unknown, because even if the court was to rule tomorrow, which it isn't, that they are point sources and they need permits. EPA and the DNR doesn't have a permit for a drainage district, though that certainly doesn't mean that a very interesting general permit couldn't be developed that would encourage them to adopt the practices that both Roger and Brett have talked about. And the results are somewhat unpredictable. I think the lawsuit was really about, or is about, accountability and responsibility. It illustrates some of the ironies in Iowa's water law and water quality history. I think that it was predictable and foreseeable and happened. It shouldn't have come as a surprise to anybody. I think it also helps perhaps illustrate what are some of the clear inadequacies of the nutrient reduction strategy that the state is committing itself to, but that still can be improved. So let me give you a little bit of an update in terms of kind of where we are now, some of the things that have happened. And as I say on this site, if you're really interested in more about this, the Agricultural Law Center on our site has a number of the legal pleadings and these talks that I've given and lists of things to do. Some of the most interesting legal developments, last fall, the drainage districts moved for a partial summary judgment, asking to have a series of the claims dismissed. And the primary theory there is basically that as drainage districts, they don't have any authority to do anything to anybody as it relates to water quality. And in fact, they're immune from being forced to do anything, and they're immune from any responsibility of paying any type of monetary damages. And so they basically have, under Iowa law, claimed a King's X. And Judge Bennett, in one of the last things that he did while he still had jurisdiction over the case, certified a series of questions to the Supreme Court. And for the non-lawyers, the issue here is this is in federal court. These are state law questions. And so the federal court has asked the state Supreme Court to answer these questions of state law for the federal court so that it then can base its ruling on what would be the most appropriate and binding answer on these state law. And the questions, Which way are we going here? The questions that he certified are a series of questions relating to this issue of immunity. And there are certainly some case litigation past that have held drainage districts couldn't be held for monetary damages for problems that were caused when, all right, there was a drainage issue that occurred. That's a little bit different question. And in fact, the Waterworks has filed their proof brief, which is their response. And their response is basically that this is an overbroad reading of the state law to claim they have this type of immunity. And in fact, if they do have this type of immunity, it's probably unconstitutional in terms of how it impacts the rights of other people who are impacted by the district. Well, another major development for those that are following along, Judge Bennett took senior status, has handed the case on to a new judge. The case had originally been scheduled for trial for this summer. Everybody knew that was wildly optimistic in terms of the moving parts and the discovery that were going to go on. The court held a meeting with the lawyers in early May, and the case at this point has been rescheduled for June. But there's another action. The defendants also moved for a summary judgment on some of the other claims, not the drainage district immunity claims, but instead they basically told the court that, one, they don't think the Waterworks has standing to bring the suit, in part because the Waterworks can't really show that they're affected in anything that these drainage districts do. And this argument, I think you see it reflected in part in Roger's slides about the scalability and the number of football fields and the amount of water, and trying to trace it back to anything that might have happened perhaps with these particular districts. And then, of course, they also raised the major issue, which is that the Clean Water Act has historically been interpreted, well, let me rephrase that, has historically been believed to exempt for all forms of agricultural drainage, including what would flow out of tile outlets. And there is some language in the Clean Water Act that exempts return flows from irrigation. And there's a court case that said when those flow through tile, those are exempt. The only problem, I think it is an issue, is that the statute really doesn't say anything about drainage flowing through tile outlets, right? And this issue of whether this is stormwater runoff, which most of us would assume means surface runoff, or, it also covers what's percolated down and comes through the tile outlets, is, I think, an issue of first impression for the federal courts and makes it a fairly significant case, at least to some extent. Okay? And so that argument or that motion to dismiss has been briefed, and so the federal court, at some point now, in the next 6 months, you will have the Iowa Supreme Court agreed to hear the certified questions. They'll probably hear arguments on that this fall. And then the federal court's going to be issuing a decision on these Clean Water Act motion for partial summary judgment. And so if the Waterworks would lose both of those, that blows the bottom out of most of the claims. If it doesn't, the case will continue. And like I said earlier, nothing happens very quickly. A couple of the things that are, at least by way of some people, controversial. You probably read stories this spring about the source of funding and where the money's coming from to pay for the defense. It's been a fairly expensive form of litigation. The drainage districts and the counties kind of passed the hat around to other counties, and a handful donated some money. Some of the agricultural groups have also provided some funding, and several of them have taken credit and responsibility for it, including Soybean Association, the corn growers. Farm Bureau said they've contributed some money. But the real interesting issue here is that the Agribusiness Association created the Agricultural Legal Defense Fund, which was a fund to raise money, and was advertised as being that it would be both confidential, tax deductible, and basically unidentifiable. And so there perhaps was as much as $2 million raised in that fund, and probably about half of it at least has already been used to pay part of the fees. The Newspaper Association got on the counties asking them for information about, well, who's exactly paying the bills for your lawsuits? And then was able to uncover a number of records, and this issue came out, and the counties, I think, got a little goosey about the idea that somebody else was paying their legal bills. materials, asked the Defense Fund to reveal the sources of the funding, and they said, well, we're not going to. And so then they parted ways. And the key here is that in parting ways, or it may be a key, is that there are going to be some fairly significant expenses to defend this suit, just as there is to bring it, right? Because the Waterworks has already identified in spending close to $1 million on the case. And then the question is, well, who's going to pay that if the drainage districts aren't going to accept it from these outside funds? And at this point, this question of who the lawsuit's against becomes, again, a little bit more significant. Because if you were a taxpayer in one of these counties and the county board of supervisors said, well, we'll use county funds to do this, you might find that objectionable because you're not actually a resident of the drainage district. There's only 21,000 acres in these drainage districts that have been sued, as opposed to the close to 1 million acres in the 3 counties that are involved. And so then the issue is, well, the Board of Supervisors, in their capacity as the trustees, have the authority to assess, right, charges against the people who own land within the drainage districts. And so that whole question about where the money comes from to pay for this will be not an insignificant issue, but it may also be one of those issues that could potentially lead people to thinking about settling it, because there certainly isn't any reason, well, let me rephrase that. There may be any number of reasons why people don't want to settle it, but at the same time, there are also perhaps good reasons why there are opportunities to settle this, short of the legislature actually doing something to help provide more significant funding for the state to address these issues. One last issue or development there, the House passed a bill that was going to try to reformulate the representation on the Waterworks Board. Some of you may have seen these TV commercials that are part of this misinformation campaign that's been going on for the last year concerning the Waterworks lawsuit, and this one talks about the need for a regional water system, which may well, in fact, be a legitimate issue. I think in the context of the lawsuit, they're in some ways a diversion. You're going to have a panel talk about what the Iowa legislature did or didn't do. I've got just a couple of slides there. I think, as you know, it was a significant issue. But just as in 2015, the legislative session ended without any significant new funding for water quality. The governor, with his SAVE idea, was an issue that took a lot of the oxygen and time during the legislative session. Unfortunately, had the effect of pitting conservation and education against each other. House Republicans came up with several different funding ideas. The Senate, with Senator Johnson and others, proposed a straight 3/8-cent sales tax increase, which is the IWIL campaign. I know you have on your tables some information about IWIL, and most of you, if you're Iowans, remember that in 2010, 63% of the population voted to amend the Constitution to create a protected natural resource trust fund to be funded with an increase in the sales tax, money to be used as a formula, and that's a significant issue that rests before us. I have a couple other slides in here because I gave a talk on this to the Iowa Bar Association on Monday. The Waters of the U.S. rule, lots of you have heard lots of yakking and talking about the Waters rule, and from my perspective, this is a largely invented political controversy that has very little real significance for Iowa or for farmers. The Waters rule is something that EPA and the federal government have to do at some point to clarify the reach of federal jurisdiction to address a series of Supreme Court decisions. The EPA went out of its way to work with agriculture and to acknowledge the exemptions that agriculture has for EPA. And as I've asked a number of audience, you'd be hard-pressed in Iowa to find a farmer that's meant somebody from the EPA, unless they might be involved in a CAFO. The Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals has maintained jurisdiction, right? You've had dozens of lawsuits filed in a variety of states. The Sixth Circuit has consolidated all of those appeals. couple final things from the Supreme Court. They, of course, rejected cert in the TMDL Chesapeake Bay Cleanup Fund, and so that blueprint is going to go forward and is going forward after a series of challenges. And they did issue a decision just a couple weeks ago that relates to when Army Corps determinations on jurisdiction can be appealed. Of course, the good Aldo tells us an ethical obligation on the part of private owners is the only visible remedy for these situations. We need to make room for nature, and there's a beautiful wetland. So with that, I'll stop and join my colleagues on a panel.
Okay, that was really a wonderful set of 3 speakers, and the questions are flowing very quickly here, so I don't even get a chance to get a question here. Let me try to get these really quick. Is surface water and groundwater interconnected?
Is that the question?
That's the question. And wouldn't it constituted meeting the concept of a significant nexus, hydrologically speaking? How is the connection of surface water and groundwater influencing the lawsuit and the decision?
The question, if you didn't hear it, is this groundwater, surface water connection, and clearly hydrologically they're connected, right? And I think that's going to be, if that becomes one of the significant issues in the lawsuit, that'll be where a lot of the kind of battling experts is going to come out on, right, as to whether what's flowing through the tile is groundwater, or whether it's surface water, or whether it's because it's so close to the surface, right, we could treat it as surface water. You know, I think, you know, if I remember right, the Waterworks in their kind of the testing that they brought forward, and you folks have at least some involvement with that, right? And that they were testing it in some of the same places that you've been testing.
I'll clarify that.
Okay, well, you can clarify. But, you know, it's after it rains, you would think that, well, then, right, the nitrates in the water would go up. But they don't, because the surface water's, you know, it's diffused them. But then, right, as the tile lines start to flow several days later, that's when they would see the spikes, right? And so I think that's part of the argument they're making, and then part of the distinction.
Great. Roger, do you have a comment to add?
Well, as I said earlier, we do a lot of water monitoring. So we know, and we have over 6,000 water samples from all the tributaries of the Raccoon. That's enabled us to go in and target where we do our work. So it's no big secret what the nitrate levels are upstream. We all know that it's tiled systems, and the tiles are a way to accumulate that water and convey it to a stream. I mean, that's what it is. And of course, surface water and groundwater are hydrologically connected as part of the water cycle. So we're not talking about deep confined aquifer water. We're talking about shallow subsurface water that's under the influence of the water that's infiltrated the soil. And so nitrate is water soluble, and when it rains, it's going to infiltrate the soil, and it's going to be, whether it comes out as base flow or it comes out as tile water, it's going to be nitrate water. Now, one last thing on the Waterworks collected the water samples that are mentioned in the lawsuit. And if you read the original, what do they call it, Neil, a deposition?
The filing.
Filing, okay, so I'm not an attorney, right? I admit it. But if you read that, it has a statement that says verified by Iowa Soybean Association. Well, what the verification is that, you know, Waterworks, as I said earlier, and Iowa Soybean have been collaborating for years. We have accredited water quality testing lab. There were 2 sets of samples. And for whatever reason, they asked us to validate the results of those water samples. We didn't know where they came from. So they were blind water samples. I don't know exactly what the motivation was. Maybe it was to mention that Iowa Soybean Association verified them. But we did not collect the water samples. All we did was do the analysis in our accredited water quality lab. Frankly, I'm I'm disappointed that that was stated that way because we are investing in the solutions upstream to help improve the water downstream. That's what we do. So that's, I just wanted to clarify that point for folks because most people read these things and they really don't know what's behind the statements.
Yeah, appreciate that. I think just kind of tying back to Provost Butler's comments this morning about, our great accomplishments of the last 100 years. One of the grand challenges in the national academies now is managing the nitrogen cycle. And so we have this grand challenge in Iowa, but we have a grand opportunity as well.
Absolutely.
And so how do we bring conservation onto the land when it costs so much money? It impacts the farmer's ability to produce on those lands. It may take land out of production, but we know that these conservation practices have a benefit to water quality improvement. So maybe I'd ask that each one of you think about that and give us a response. And Roger, if you're ready to tee up on that.
When I go out and talk to farmers about the nutrient reduction strategy, what I like to talk about is that how can we use the strategy to catalyze our agricultural system to be better? If we retain the water, if we retain the nutrients in the landscape, farmers are in the business of utilizing nutrients. So improving the soil is going to be a key part of that. Starting with the soil, in fact, is going to be a key part of that, and that's what cover crops do. Cover crops help us retain water in the landscape, helps introduce more carbon into the system, especially when it's vulnerable, so we're reducing the loss. We're reducing the risk of loss of nutrients from the landscape. And when you start thinking about reducing tillage, and when you start thinking about adding more diversity to the landscape, you're making that agricultural system more resilient. So if we can capture more value upstream, conservation will drive itself. But we're going to also have to mitigate some of the externalities that come from our production system by targeting edge of field practices, the wetlands and what have you. And so we can do that, as I said, through watershed planning. And this issue of removing land from production, we know there's some locations within farms that are more vulnerable to loss, and that putting additional resources into those places are actually have a return on investment challenges. So we can target places on the farm with alternative land uses, like with buffers and wetlands and things like that. So that's where we can marry these things.
Great. Brett?
I think, on most of these issues, though Roger and I disagree on a lot of things, I think we come at it from the same position. We're both from farm families in Iowa. We both hunt and fish. We hunt and fish with the same guys. We spend time outside. We just see different angles to getting to the goal we want to get to. And on that front, I think one of the things that we would point out is if we want to get conservation on the landscape, we have to make conservation pay. Today, if you are a farmer and you put conservation on your land, say you set aside your buffers, and your neighbor isn't required to, and your neighbor is allowed to grow corn right through the stream on his farm and make an extra $2,000 or $4,000 or whatever, that's money he's going to use to compete against you next year. So right now, any farmer that voluntarily steps up and spends their own money on conservation is intentionally putting themselves at a disadvantage to the guys who aren't. So this has to start with a floor being put in place where everybody has to be required to start. Everybody's got to get something basic going so that it's fair for everyone. And then hopefully over time, precision conservation, some revisiting of how we value farmland. Right now, we only value farmland in Iowa primarily on how many acre or bushels of corn you can get from it. It's not deducted if it's bad for growing corn. If you shouldn't be growing corn on it, you can charge the same price for it that somebody can charge for perfect land because of the way we value it in Iowa. There's a lot of broken things in the system that farmers have nothing to do about. They can't control that we've got to address for them at the same time. So I think part of this in getting the conservation there, start with everybody fairly, and then we have got to address the systemic things that punish people for doing conservation and reward you for not doing conservation.
Neil?
Well, I think part of the challenge is how we even talk about it, and the whole idea that either we have to make conservation pay or that people can't be asked to do it if it costs them to spend money is a problem. You know, Secretary Wallace, writing in the 38 Yearbook of Agriculture, said, the social lesson of soil waste is that we owe a duty to the soil that we've been slow to recognize, and that no person has the right to destroy soil even if they do own it in fee simple. And that logic was in part what was behind the passage of the Model Soil and Water Conservation District Act. It's what led to the creation of soil and water conservation districts in Iowa. It's why Iowa has a provision in the Iowa Code in 161A43 that makes it the duty of every landowner in the state to comply with the soil loss limits established by the soil and water conservation districts. It doesn't say if you can afford to, right? It's a function of being a duty of being a landowner. And it's also what the Iowa Supreme Court upheld as constitutional in the 1979 case, Ortner versus Woodbury County Soil and Water Conservation District, and said the fact that it requires people to expend funds is a cost that the state has the right to expect because of the vital role that soil plays to the state. And so, the idea that expecting people to do conservation is something that we don't have any, right to expect unless we pay them to do it, or that it pays for itself, I think starts us off on the wrong foot. And part of the change with our soil conservation situation, I think, is in part going to come through landowner education. The fact that you see a change in land tenure in Iowa, with over half the state being farmed under tenancy now, creates an opportunity for landowners to ask and expect more from their tenants when it comes to conservation. And certainly government programs and assistance is part of it as well. But we have to start with the idea that there's a basic duty of being a landowner to protect your soil. It both certainly is an economic value to you, but it's also, essentially a public duty for protecting the resources of the state of Iowa.
Great. And so this one is, and again, I'll paraphrase a bit. Iowa's been a leader in agriculture for, decades or hundreds of years. And now today we look to our neighboring states, to the south and to the north, and we see programs similar to the IWIL proposal that has been in Iowa for several years, have been adopted in Missouri and Minnesota, as well as a grass waterway policy in Minnesota. Why do we think, or why do you think, or what do you think the next steps will be to the state of Iowa for making that next step, to getting IWIL passed or some significant funding passed?
Well, I'm proud of the fact that the Soybean Association was in support of the IWIL campaign, and we've been working actively with the coalition to support it. It's going to take resources. It's a shared investment, and I think there are legislators in the room. There's going to be a panel later. This is their job to reconcile how these investments are going to be made, whether it's IWIL or the governor's plan with SAVE or some other form. It's not a tens of millions of dollars of investment. That's one of the reasons I had the scope and scale diagram there. It's hundreds of millions. And when you think about when the last time we did a big infrastructure change like this, we drained the Iowa landscape. So it can be done. We can make these investments. And what we're talking about is, what's the next generation look like for Iowa agriculture? And how do we do this with our cities? One issue with IWIL is it doesn't really have an element that connects with their cities. So think about that. But I just want to state that we are committed to working with the legislature and the governor, and we hope that the next legislative session results in some significant and sustained funding to take us into the next generation, because that's what we're talking about.
I'd like to speak just to IWIL for a moment. I know many people in here are either part of the IWIL coalition or belong to organizations that are. In another role, I chair the Public Policy Committee of the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, which has been one of the major proponents of I Will, and it's an important opportunity for the state. The vote that was taken in 2010 showed the interest and the commitment of the people to these resources, the formula that was there. And Roger, I think that the formula certainly does have things for cities in it. The REAP program, clean water, trails, those aren't entirely rural issues. And another point, too, I want to come back to something, Larry, and you're talking about conservation. You talked about the idea of taking land out of production because we're putting in the grass. Well, part of our problem in the state is we've tried to extirpate livestock from much of the state of Iowa, and as a result, taken the need for grass out of the equation. And there is going to be an important role for grass and for livestock and for other uses of grass. And so I think it sets up a false comparison to think about land either being in crops and productive, or if it's somehow in conservation or something else that it's unproductive. It's just productive in a different way.
No, that's a good point. There is a comment in here, a question, and I'd maybe just add upon that, Neil, is that why do we consider these two row crops as the productive use of our land? Couldn't we have fiber? Couldn't we have trees, other vegetation that's growing there, sequestering carbon, doing other things, fuel crops? What could our landscape look like if we started adopting more than just a predominance towards corn and soybeans?
If I might, I think the I Will folks here, and some of you may know, I have been, since before I Will, an outspoken critic. As state chairman of Trout Unlimited, we came out against I Will. It is not because I think we don't need a 3/8 cent sales tax. 100% in favor of that, 100% in favor of getting it done. But through Trout Unlimited and our regional work, I had experience with the Lessard system that Minnesota adopted. And what we voted on and what Minnesota has are light years apart. In Minnesota, the formula is fixed permanently. In Iowa, the legislature can change the formula with a bill anytime they want in the future. In Minnesota, it's a fixed term. And none of the decisions on funding are made until after the session is over. So if the politicians decide not to fund something, hoping Lessard will fund it, there's no guarantee, and they don't get to vote on whether Lessard funds it or not. Here, all of our money is just being handed to state agencies, and there's nothing in there that will prevent the legislature from just cutting the budgets of those agencies to make up for that money and making it replacement money. And I feel that if we don't have those checks in place, we are guaranteed to see those things happen in probably the first decade of this bill being in place. So I'm in favor of the approach, but I would like to see the amendment have permanent fixed funding that can't be screwed around with, and I would like to see it be decided by an independent body outside of the DNR and the legislature that can come at this with new perspectives and do things that are politically expedient, even if the politics aren't friendly.
All right, thank you. Any follow-up to that, Roger or Neil?
Well, certainly in this session, right, in the last couple of years, you've seen that challenge of the discussion around I Will, because I Will was a broad natural resource protection initiative, and now the discussion about water quality has been hijacked essentially by the nutrient reduction strategy without any discussion about the other components that were an important part of the I Will discussion. And so I think that's an important issue that Brent raises, that there are any number of resource issues and needs in the state, and that all of them need to be addressed, or at least that was I think what the voters thought they were passing when they passed I Will.
They would step aside from row crop for just a minute and focus a little bit on confined feeding operations. The facilities are coming on strong in Iowa. There is some differences county to county in terms of planning and zoning related to confined animal feeding operations. What should Iowa's approach as a state be towards planning and zoning and regulation towards siting of confined animal feeding operations?
Well, as you noted when I started, I've been at this a long time, and so, I started teaching agricultural law when Iowa's hogs industry was still at 50,000 farms, and almost all of them were independents. And then we've went through at least 2 or 3 different eras of the hog wars in terms of the fights between county authority and state authority. And at least from a legal standpoint, the battle is pretty much over. These are state law issues, both in terms of establishing the environmental rules, and the role of county governments is extremely limited in terms of either involvement in the placing, the citing and approval, and the application of county zoning ordinances. And so that doesn't mean that the conflicts and the tensions that are felt locally aren't real, but at least as I read Iowa's current legal regime, and even the story that the Register ran last week, right, in which people are, depending on how you look at it, either gaming the system or how it's kind of magical that that last pig doesn't get put into the building, right, so that it's a $24.99, and that puts them into, you know, a different category of regulation, or we actually put them into a smaller facility and then, right, hand them out to a series of related people with LLCs, all designed basically to escape the application of the state's regulatory system. Now, you know, I mean, it may be human nature that any of us would try to seek ways to avoid, right, the application of rules that we either think are going to cost us extra money, but there are reasons why we have those type of protections. And, you know, if you had a legislature that is responsive, as it could well be, and, you know, arguably an agency that was perhaps, you know, either equipped with the authority to look at those type of things. Under USDA programs, if you're involved in a scheme or device essentially to defeat the rules, there's a way the USDA can apply them to you, right? And we don't have anything that appears to be on a parallel, and so the agency finds itself with its kind of hands tied because, well, this is what the rules say. It's at $2,500 and it's designed for $24.95. And, you know, I think the problem is that those type of actions then are what feed the tension and the cynicism and the anger on the part of the citizens who see it happening to them and see the rules that we do have being evaded or essentially toothless.
Great.
I just add, I'm a farm kid. The smell doesn't bother me. Manure is part of life. It's part of what we need in Iowa. But on the other hand, having pigs on the farm as a kid, I cannot remember one pig I was not happy to see go to the slaughterhouse. They are ugly, mean, obnoxious, unpleasant animals to be around. Why people want to farm 200 to 2,000 at a time, I would never understand. But I think that given those decisions, those are the farmers' decisions. The thing we don't look at in Iowa is the problem is not the pig. The problem is the manure. Manure by the shovel full is fertilizer. Manure by the swimming pool full is pollution. And we have a manure pollution problem. If you made every permit that came in for a CAFO say, this is the field I'm going to put 160 pounds of manure per acre on, and nobody else can claim that field, and you made them list it and show where they had their contracts, 2 things will happen. One, you will see that there are vast swaths of Iowa where they cannot legally get rid of manure at this point because they have to double and triple apply it to fields because it's too far to drive economically to get to a field that doesn't already have manure on it. If we just went through the process of making sure you didn't have density that exceeded your disposal capability, that would be a nice first step, and we haven't done that. So I would like to say a little science added to the process to trump the politics. Science first, then sort out after the hard rules where we're going to bend them. We bend first and then squeeze the science in after the fact, and it hurts us.
Roger?
I'm not sure there's much more to be said, but the thing, a lot of farmers want that manure because it is fertilizer, and so that's a big part of it. The other thing is I'm about performance. I'm about watersheds. I'm about less pollution. So I don't have a statement about which way the policy should be, and I think Neil kind of articulated the way it is. And but from my perspective, this is about performance, and there are ways to manage this manure. It could help our soil resource, integrating the manure into the landscape. And you know, think about the fact that we grow the crops and we have the livestock, and I agree with you, Neil, that we need to bring more cows into the picture to deal with our grass systems, gives Iowa an advantage. You know, having more diversity gives us an economically more resilient agriculture system. So we support the livestock industry. We support a responsible livestock industry. We want to see our soils better, our livestock integrated, and the management of the manure in such a way that it isn't a pollutant. So that's about action. And I early in my career, there was all this debate about local control, and I'm not sure people really want local control. What we really need is local action. That's where it happens. So that's all I'd add.
All right, thank you. We're going to take a slightly different format for this question. I'm going to ask Roger to go first, then Brett, and then Professor Hamilton's going to give them a grade. Pretend it's early 2015 and you're asked to be the mediator between the Des Moines Water Works and the 3 counties that have been sued. What would you do in that mediation to recommend a solution?
Yeah. So I think it was in my presentation. I support a one water approach. I support a watershed-based approach. We have targeted watersheds we're working in. We don't have the resources to do all the 108 Huck 12 watersheds. Not all of those watersheds are contributing the same amount of nutrient loading into the river, but we know, we pretty well know with science and technology which watersheds we need to be working in. And so I think, how would we integrate the science and technologies, and we need to be doing a feasibility study of what it's going to take to do that. I already estimate it's going to be a $500 to $600 million investment upstream from Des Moines. That's what we're owning. Des Moines Water Works, using their figures that I read in the paper, talks about $100 million. You know, they're building a wetland as a natural nutrient removal system. And remember those 13 football fields? They're only treating a small portion. So I advocate doing both, because it's not just about drinking water, right? It's about the Mississippi. It's about our soils. So that's what, if I'm mediating, I'm trying to help the watershed community and the downstream community come together.
I would take a slightly different approach. I think I would first come into this reminding the drainage districts that removing the pollution in Des Moines does not solve the pollution problem from Sac City to Des Moines, and everybody between Des Moines and Sac City has the right to clean water too. So removing it at the edge of the field is the logical place to get the problem cleaned up. The second thing I would remind them is that the entire functional purpose of a drainage district is not to decide where drainage goes. It's to decide who's going to pay for their share of when the drainage goes in, and who's responsible for paying for the cleanup and the maintenance of the system among the farmers that benefit from it. I can think of no body better suited for deciding who's responsible for removing how much nitrogen from the water, because they are on the ground, they are the stakeholders in the system, everybody there is at the table. They are the perfect body to be put in charge of not necessarily making them permits, but saying you're the first line of defense, and if you need to put in a wetland, you need to sit down with the 13 farmers in this district to decide whose land it's going to be and how we're going to get the money to pay that person for the land and how we're going to run. That's all local decision. That's where that belongs. Drainage districts should approach this, and I think legislators should look at it as a simple change to the code, and drainage districts have all the power they need to solve this problem. They're the front line, they're on the ground, they're local, and they're made up of farmers. I can think of no better place to put the solution than in the drainage districts. And then I would go from there, saying now, how can the city and the drainage districts get together to craft that solution so that the problem is solved where it was caused? And how can cities go to the legislature to help drive the change that needs to happen to make that happen realistically?
Okay, Professor, you have to give grades first and then you can comment.
Well, they seem like both bright students. They've attended, and we'll give them A minuses, which is a very good grade, something they can write to their parents about.
But there's still work to do.
But, In terms of mediating it, what the Waterworks asked for is that, right, these people acknowledge that they're point sources and that they ask somebody for a permit. And while the litigation, if it's viewed as impact litigation, right, is this larger question about agriculture and its role under the Clean Water Act, in terms of actually mediating and settling this case, there would be the opportunity for the drainage districts to say, okay, let's say we in fact admitted that we were a point source, what would you want us to do? And then the Waterworks could come back and say, well, geez, okay, what could you do? And say, well, my God, we could require buffer strips along all of the collection ditches. We're going to set a goal of 75% cover crops within the district within 5 years. And we're going to actually have nutrient management plans on the part of farmers, which some may have, but there's nothing that requires you to have. In Iowa, and identify a series of the practices and say, okay, and we're going to do that across these districts. It's going to take us a little time, and in fact, that's what we'll propose to the DNR and the EPA, that we're going to put in the general permit. And at that point, what could the Waterworks say? What more could we have asked for? Other than, and I think you all recognize, the really fighting legal issues. Nobody in agriculture wants to have anyone admit that they may actually be a point source and that the Clean Water Act might apply to them, all right? And so that's part of the challenge. Because if anybody was at that March 2015 water conference, one of the speakers was from the Minnesota drainage districts, and they were talking about all the things the drainage districts were doing to clean up water, right? It's not that they don't either know how or have the authority to, whether it was constructed wetlands or other things. So, the issue is drainage districts certainly could be part of the water quality solution. And if their view is, we don't want to, you can't make us, right, and we aren't going to, well, then we're going to continue to be at loggerheads.
Can I?
Yes.
Yeah, so
Roger's
I'm not
trying to
sure,
get back
but
up to an A.
my approach, I just want to defend my approach. So, so I don't argue that drainage, they're very similar to watersheds. Watersheds are made up of multiple drainage districts. And what I'm talking about, and I agree, this issue of claiming that they're point sources, to me, the reality is that a point source is a closed system. It's like a factory. You know what's in the box. And these drainage districts, yeah, they come out of a tributary, they come out of a pipe, they come out of a tributary, but it's variable, okay? The rainfall is variable. It's an open system. So that reconciling that is problematic. And what I would say is that the non-point source policy space is unwritten policy space. We have not figured out how to really make progress in that space. We're interested in performance, and I agree that watersheds and drainage districts could be part of the solutions. It's a little difficult to ask them to be in that camp when they're being sued. That's problematic. But it's an opportunity for this state to be better in the future, one where we deal with the externalities that come from the system, and we can add more values. And it's about realizing the 2116 vision of what this state can be.
Thanks. And
Just
Brett?
one quick point to add at the end that people I think keep forgetting is no matter what the outcome of this lawsuit, we have a nutrient reduction strategy and piles of science this high that says we will not solve the nutrient problem if we don't filter drainage water. So even if the lawsuit says they're not responsible, somebody still has to make somebody responsible to clean this problem up. We would have been better off, I think, tackling it head on and putting them in charge rather than stalling for 5 years to fight over it before we do what we inevitably had to do in the first place anyway.
The solutions before the lawsuit are the same and will be the same after the lawsuit.
Good. And so to follow on that, with those solutions and understanding and with champion farmers that we have, that we really look to for the wonderful conservation that they do, could we adopt champion watersheds at the Huck 12 scale? And do you think that we could show a 45% reduction in nitrogen from half a dozen Huck 12s in the state of Iowa?
Yes, undoubtedly.
Yeah, I absolutely think we can. I think the science, the technology is there. We can do it. It's infrastructure, right? These constructed wetlands are expensive. They are expensive. You're taking expensive land out of production, okay, so you probably got to buy that land. We're talking about, so we just need to realize that we can do it. It's an infrastructure investment. And it's a public works type investment. But we can do this, and the science shows that we can do it. We need to have integrated systems, both in-field and edge-of-field practices, and it's doable.
Hey, Larry, you've touched on something I think that is people find frustrating, probably from both directions, in that clearly there are any number of farmers that are doing wonderful things in terms of conservation and have taken the water quality challenge seriously. There was an op-ed in Wednesday's paper by the head of the corn growers, right, to that effect. And you probably all know or have met farmers who are, and I'm sure they, right, hear about the Waterworks lawsuit or what they read about, when EWG demonizes farmers, right, as everybody loves to say, that's what they're doing, even though what you're trying to do is bring some good science and data to it, as I'm sure they find it frustrating. But at the same time, I think other people find it frustrating that agriculture doesn't lack for being able to kind of bring out the handful of model farmers who are doing these things, and the people that Roger's working with in that Rock Creek watershed project and the work that they're doing and adding soil health into it. But it appears that, at least on the land, that these are a relatively small number of the total number of farms. And it's the whole question about, well, so what's it taken for everybody else, right? Where's the scalability of this issue? And, part of the challenge or problem with the nutrient reduction strategy is that people treat like, oh my God, we just discovered we have a water quality problem. We've been dealing with water quality issues not for 30 or 40 years, but you can go back, right, to the Iowa conservation plans Ding Darling was involved with in the 20s and 30s. It was the same waters, the same lands, many of the same issues, and this isn't a new question for us. Part of what is new is we change, right, how heavy we have our foot on the accelerator in terms of production. We change the economics of it. We change the identity of the landowners and the people who are making the decisions, but we don't do conservation so that it stays done. And I think this is in part a price that we're paying because of the anti-regulatory dogma that drives a lot of the state's discussion, that there's no rules, no room for establishing these minimum accepted standards of care on the part of landowners. And it shouldn't surprise us that we have the problems that we have.
One last question.
I was just going to answer quickly. In Wisconsin, they have achieved those reductions in 2 years with their nutrient reduction strategy. So yes, it is definitely possible, and it has been done.
In some subwatersheds?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So this will be the last question. For all good intentions, sometimes there are unintended consequences. And with the cover crops being shown as one of the practices that we could use for nutrient reduction, but yet the termination process using glyphosate to terminate that crop, are there potential unintended consequences of 26 million acres of cover crops followed by a glyphosate?
Well, I think we know that these natural systems will adapt and adjust. We know we have weed resistance issues with Roundup, and so you have to be diverse in your management approaches. You have to manage for that, and I think we know those things. There's lots of ways to terminate. I hope that we don't terminate with tillage, right?
Deep tillage.
Yeah. But I would acknowledge that. There's no silver bullet here. These are integrated issues that require attentive and diverse management approaches.
I would argue there is a silver bullet. We just haven't found a way to profit from prairie yet. And that's what it comes down to there at the end is we know, you put the same soils and the same things in prairie, and soil that leaches 55 pounds of nitrogen a year under tillage will yield 0.2 pounds of nitrogen per year when you put it in prairie. It's moving because of agriculture and the way we do agriculture. There's a lot of things we can change, and that's one thing I kind of stay out of, because the psychology of getting farmers to change is a multi-generation thing. I see it in my own family. But I do think that there's solutions that don't require us to change the psychology of all of agriculture to get them in place that we could be doing, like buffers. No-till, that's a mentality, a financial investment, a multiple things you've got to do to convert your farm on something like that. Putting in buffers you can do next Thursday. Let's get those things done. Let's get them working on the landscape, and then let's fight these decades-long, in multi-generational changes from a system that is already working to be clean rather than one that continues to get worse while we wait.
Great, thanks. Neil, anything to add?
I think that there's some real power in being able to use the data and the analytics that we're out collecting on all these gizmos, right, that we've put on every farm piece of equipment we have, and being able to use it not just for production enhancement, but for environmental protection. Being able to provide a landowner with a real-time map of the water quality issues and the soil losses that are coming off of their land because of a production system can be an important determinant, and at least I would hope, in the calculation of farming practices. And we need to be able to harness and use information in creative ways.
We agree with that.
I would like to offer my personal thanks to the three of you. I know that you get drawn into many of these conversations, and today was really dynamic, and we really appreciate your thoughtful views.
Thank you.